the editorial inside The Sun on Saturday, the lessons for us are clear. Osama bin Laden may be dead, but the tentacles of Al-Qaeda spread deep into the heart of Western nations. Our security cannot be relaxed. Terror suspects cannot be released on human rights grounds. And we must ask ourselves whether, like Norway, we offer too cushy a life to bogus asylum seekers. Now that statement just sums up everything that you and I hate about the Murdoch media. There are a number of people who wanted to be here tonight and who couldn't. And I have a message here from the journalist George Monbiot, the campaigning journalist, who has only just got back from a holiday and so couldn't make it. And he says, he wanted this to be read out at the meeting: Murdoch represents everything that has gone wrong with the media in Britain and worldwide. His aim, like those of the other multimillionaires who own the corporate press, is to represent his needs as our needs, to suggest that a world that is better for the ultra-rich is a world that is better for everyone. While Murdoch is more powerful than the other proprietors, the issue does not stop with him. I hope the meeting recognises that there is a systemic problem here. Our challenge is to confront the attempts of most media proprietors to reshape the world in their interests. Now, I'd like to introduce the first speaker tonight. Now, my trade union, the National Union of Journalists, has fought everything that Murdoch has stood for the last generation, whether it's on trade union rights or cuts to staff and conditions, and on journalistic ethics. And so I'm very proud to introduce the brand new General Secretary of the National Union of Journalists, Michelle Stanistreet.
Thanks today for organising tonight, and thank you to all of you who've come, and I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting evening. I look forward to hearing to your contributions. That would help if I press the button. Thank you to everybody for coming. Well, I mean, in just 3 weeks, the balance of forces that have served the political establishment so well for decades have shifted beyond recognition. The unfolding scandal at News International has unmasked and shone a light on the cosy, the incestuous and corrupt relationships between our political leaders, our police and our press. Day by day, the power wielded by Rupert Murdoch and his executives, staggering in its grip, has been revealed in all its tawdriness. Those little bits of detail, the colour, the glasses of Prosecco and cosy dinners in the Cotswolds, highlight the craven behaviour of those who've governed our society as they fell over themselves to bow to Murdoch's wishes, playing their part in the self-fulfilling prophecy that with his ownership of swathes of our media came an unchallengeable power that could make or break individuals and indeed governments. From David Cameron, we've had the Clinton-esque denials, the lines reminiscent of the infamous Monica Lewinsky denials of not having any inappropriate conversations, when frankly it's becoming increasingly clear that there weren't any dealings with Murdoch that were appropriate. To a man, those self-same people who've perfected the art of toadying are now fallen over themselves to defy Murdoch. Who'd have thought we'd have heard David Cameron vow, as he did last week, never again should we let a media group get too powerful. Yet just weeks ago, we'd never have heard one of Murdoch's chums stand up in public linking phone hacking to the £8 billion audacious bid for B-Sky B. We'd never have heard a minister say that the tentacles of Murdoch's power have gone too far, that the concentration of such a large chunk of our media in one man's hands was dangerous or unhealthy. We'd never have got politicians standing up and admitting that they were too scared to stand up to Murdoch's interests in fear of their personal peccadillos being revealed to all in the pages of the News of the World. We certainly didn't hear any outraged howls when James Murdoch exploited his friendships to demand and secure policy designed to emasculate the BBC and give his satellite broadcaster the upper hand. So the current hand-wringing and expressions of regret about what's gone on have felt like a particularly hollow group therapy session. Not an especially cathartic experience when it's clear the real regret lies, not in mistakes and errors of judgment, but in people being found out. When it took the public unmasking of the hacking of a phone of a murdered teenage girl to get at the truth. When it feels pretty certain that we're not there yet, that there'll be more revelations and more scandals yet to come. The unveiling of this endemic corruption has, of course, put the spotlight on journalism and journalistic practices. While some might applaud the passing of the news of the world, you won't find me celebrating the closure of a newspaper or the cynical sacrificing of hundreds of jobs done in a desperate bid to protect those at the top of News International who presided over a culture that created and indeed industrialised such unacceptable practices. That it happened at News International should come as no surprise. This is the man who 25 years ago at Wapping sought to brutally break the unions. Then, like he has for decades, he had the backing of the courts, the police and the government as instruments of his will. And it's no surprise that the scale of systemic abuse has happened at a company where the NUJ has been effectively locked out for decades. Journalists there have been denied the collective protection and representation of an independent trade union. There is a clear parallel between the effect of union busting and the moral vacuum that's been allowed to proliferate at News International. Collective trade union representation is a moral and a human right, and it's high time Murdoch was forced to let the NUJ back in. Has a code of conduct, not a mere document, but a set of principles that govern all our members and is at the heart of what we stand for as a union. It's something that our chapels and our branches campaign around and ensure that ethics is not just an add-on to our industrial work. So as part of our work, we've been demanding for some years now that journalists have the right to a conscience clause, so that when they stand up on a principle of journalistic ethics, as colleagues of mine and I did many years ago in the Express Chapel several times, they have the protection against being dismissed when they put their heads above the parapet. It's absolutely vital that we secure that commitment as part of the inquiry now to come. And it's also vital that our campaign tackles the fundamental problem of the attack on workers' rights and on trade union representation. Just today, the CBI is out clamouring for employment laws to be watered down to become mere guidelines. So whilst we all know we've enough of a problem getting employers at the moment to stick to the law, we need to be clear that these are our hard-won rights and we need to be prepared to stand up and defend them from attack, as the attacks will continue to come. Now, ever since Wapping, Murdoch's consistently used and abused his media dominance for his own business ends, buying political favours to suit his own corporate interests, and so he in turn was rewarded with the caveats in the Employment Relations Act and the relaxation of media ownership laws. The B-Sky-B deal, offered up to him by his Tory pals, was the deal of his life. And so as a union who's been campaigning long and hard against this deal, it's a huge victory to see Murdoch denied this prize. But we all need to be clear that this fight is not over. Even last week, Cameron couldn't resist appeasing his backbenchers with a swipe at the BBC when he said, above all, we need to ensure that no one voice, not News Corporation, not the BBC, becomes too powerful. Frankly, to even utter the two organisations in the same sentence is shameful, particularly as it becomes blindingly clear that the shabby deal done on the BBC licence fee settlement, clinched in secret behind closed doors in unseemly haste last autumn, was carried out against a backdrop of huge pressure from James Murdoch baying for the Beeb's blood. The NUJ is demanding the immediate renegotiation of this unfair and outrageous licence fee settlement, one that's led to the axing of vital services in the World Service and the imposition of 20% budget cuts, compromising quality and programming. And as a result of this deal, our members are fighting to save jobs. NUJ members across the BBC went on strike the week before last, and they're going out on strike again this coming Monday to show that they're not prepared to stand by and see their colleagues forced out of the door. The broken model of media ownership in the UK has very clearly been laid bare by this crisis, but it's not restricted to the national press. Our local and regional newspapers are being brought to their knees by the mismanagement and sheer corporate greed of the big four newspaper groups, including Johnston Press, where our members at Titles in South Yorkshire entered their second week of strike action yesterday. They're brave and their principled action exemplifies why the Leveson inquiry must take the broadest of views on media ownership. Urgent action is needed to tackle the problems of companies having a stranglehold on our newspapers, squeezing the very life out of them in the process. And I'm really delighted that we've got with us today one of our strikers, Darren's here, who's been acting as our FOC in the Doncaster titles who are out on strike, and I'm in awe of them. They're doing a brilliant job, particularly in drawing in the local community to this fight. So I wish them all the best, and I hope you'll hear from them later. And let's not forget how the lid was wrenched open on the corruption and rotten heart of the Murdoch empire. It was down to brilliant, inspiring and incisive and dogged investigative journalism from Nick Davies and now others. That's what we need more of, and it's the kind of journalism under the current models of media ownership that's become something of an endangered species in newsrooms up and down the country, because it costs and it needs resources and it needs journalists there to do that work. And as we speak, journalists across Fortress Wapping are particularly anxious about their futures and their jobs, particularly speculation grows about American investors clamouring to pull the plug on all of News International's papers here in the UK. Now, our national newspaper title should not be allowed to be dispensed with at the whim of one man or his corporate investors, nor should they be the instruments by which he wields power and furthers his commercial interests. Journalism and press freedom is simply far too important. That's why the NUJ is working with members to explore alternative forms of ownership, looking at ways of developing cooperative structures and of attracting those who want to invest in journalism for the public and the democratic good. At the moment, we're also obviously taking a leading role in ensuring that any changes to press regulation are done on our terms, and that press freedom isn't sacrificed in the clamour to draw a line under the failures of the PCC employer-led model of self-regulation to date. So all I say is this is another Wapping moment in our history. If there's a time, it's got to be now when we can harness that same spirit of resistance demonstrated in so inspiringly by all of those who took part in the Wapping dispute. And we all join together collectively to work together to extend media democracy, accountability and genuine plurality, and in the process stand up for ethical quality journalism. So thank you for coming tonight.
The next speaker is a veteran of the Wapping dispute 25 years ago, which is when Murdoch overnight sacked thousands of print workers and journalists, and in so doing started this race to the bottom in terms of quality and conditions that Michelle has spoken about. And many people who work in the media, most of the people who work in the media are not journalists, and we've always been strongest when we've stood together. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Tony Burke, the Assistant General Secretary in Unite.
Dave, thanks very much for the invite for Unite to come along and speak at this meeting. And I'm sure, as has already been said, that you will be aware that 25 years ago, Murdoch made his move to Wapping, sacking 5,500 print workers overnight. And this year we've been commemorating the events by an exhibition by Unite, the NUJ, and the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom. And I'm proud to say tomorrow that exhibition reopens at the TUC Congress House. So please go along and look at what actually happened 25 years ago and read by the display the very difficult situation that our members and the journalists went through all those years ago. It's important because the exhibition places in context the situation that we now find ourselves with News International and what conclusions we can draw from it, and that's the purpose of the meeting this evening. The Wapping dispute, let's dispel some myths. The Wapping dispute was not about new technology. It never was. Murdoch had global ambitions to expand his multimedia empire, and 42 years ago he bought the News of the World, and from there on we face this corrosive influence on journalism and trade unions, and in particular on British public life, and it's exposed, this past few weeks has exposed the result of that. 25 years ago, Murdoch broke trade unionism in his newspapers, but what he did was create massive profits, and he used them profits to launch a right-wing multimedia empire which extended its tentacles into the political class. The fact was, Chair, comrades, that Rupert Murdoch planned to break the print unions and the NUJ long before that strike began in January 1986. Murdoch actually bought the Wapping plant in the Docklands in 1979. And irrespective of any disagreements over working conditions, jobs and training, union members, our members, were expecting to transfer to Wapping. But we all know now that in secret this company installed new presses and new technology well before the strike began. They replaced the workforce using an employment agency and disgracefully the electricians' union. New machinery was ordered and installed, and a contract was signed with TNT for the transport of newspapers by road instead of rail. And in the autumn of 1985, Murdoch declared that the new site was intended to produce a new daily evening London newspaper. You remember that? The mythical London Post. And when he produced that paper, he said, "These are the terms that the unions can go to Wapping on. There will be no recognition of our chapels or our branches, and no negotiations at local level. There will be no strikes or industrial actions for any reason. Immediate dismissal would happen to anybody taking part in industrial action with no right of appeal. And management had the exclusive right to manage. They wanted a legally binding contracts, leaving our unions and individual union members open to court action." Now, these preconditions have nothing to do with technology. Murdoch was able to take advantage of the perfect storm: the availability of technology, anti-union legislation brought in by the Thatcher government, a rogue union, and the Conservative government willing to place the whole of the resources of the state, including the Metropolitan Police, at Murdoch's disposal. As I say, the purpose of this meeting is to talk about where we go from here. And in 2011, it's right that we look at the consequences of that dispute 25 years ago. Now, Chair and Comrades, Unite believes that the phone hacking scandal and the involvement of the Metropolitan Police is the logical continuation of the mindset that created the anti-union fortress Wapping in 1986. News International generated massive profits to expand their empire beyond newspapers into the global media, starting with Sky, and from there on he was able to dominate the right-wing media by creating Fox News in America, which my colleague Chris McLaughlin of Tribune has aptly titled "A Bile-Driven Facts Challenge US TV Station." We all know the Prime Ministers and Presidents bowed the knee at the Murdoch altar, as Michelle has said, and his executives and management influence knew no bounds until it lapped at the door of number 10 Downing Street. Comrades, Murdoch's key executives have behaved like members of a despotic banana republic. Not just celebrities and footballers who were fair game, but politicians, lawyers, and the Metropolitan Police were all fearful of what could happen if you cross Murdoch and his empire. And I agree that we should place on record the thanks to those journalists who have dug deep to expose this, but also to our intrepid MPs, such as Tom Watson and Chris Bryant, for their fearlessness and refusal to be intimidated by Murdoch, and also finally to Ed Miliband for shaking off the fear to take on this nest of vipers. So where do we go from here post-Hackgate? Well, they've already said we're going to see the scrapping of the Press Complaints Commission, but let's be fair, they're putting it out of its misery. There's going to be an inquiry into cross-media ownership. That's something that the unions, the NUJ, Unite, the unions before that, and the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom have been arguing for years. But it's not just about cross-media ownership. As Michelle said, it's about trade union rights. After Wapping, Murdoch was able to set up a Mickey Mouse union, an in-house union, NISA, the News International Staff Association. I should call it an in-mouse union, actually. But he's used that to keep unions out. And even with the advent 1997 of a Labour government, and the introduction of legislation that gave us the legal right to gain recognition, an exclusion was provided which allowed NISA, which is not independent but is fully funded by the Murdoch empire and run by the company, to be excluded from the trade union recognition legislation. Now, as my colleague Keith Ewing, an expert in employment law, has explained, that this is because they were able to slip in a little notice provision in the legislation in the shape of paragraph 35. This provision appears to give an employer an immunity from the duty to recognise a union, whatever level the support for that union, where there is a pre-existing agreement where the employer has granted bargaining rights to a non-independent creature of its own making, such as the NISA. So questions, Chair and comrades, now need to be asked. How did paragraph 35 get in there in the first place? Was it at the insistence of News International? I would say yes. That paragraph, as Michelle has said, means that unions are denied the right to represent members in collective bargaining in News International. Yes, it's true that the legislation does provide for derecognition of bodies such as the NISA, but this is an obvious non-starter, as it would require an employee of Murdoch to begin a derecognition ballot and provide evidence of the support for the request from the workforce as a whole to derecognise that union. Now, seriously, can you see in the Murdoch empire that actually beginning to happen? So, Chair, comrades, Unite believes that the events of the past few weeks and the 25th anniversary of the dispute at Wapping should remind our politicians, as they consider how to prevent media abuses and the abuses that we've seen over the past few years. What we need, I believe, is a new framework of employment law and trade rights to rebalance the power in the country, to prevent the powerful from abusing their position in our lives. Chair and comrades, the sacking of 5,500 people helped Murdoch create a media organisation that has no morals, no scruples, no boundaries, and no fear of the law. So 25 years on, what cannot be denied is that the breaking of the print unions and the National Union of Journalists was about power, and it still is about power, and that's why it's important we learn the lessons from those momentous events 25 years ago and make sure that this never damn well happens again in this country. Thank you very much.
The question of action, that brings me to our next speaker. Now, if you were watching the television on Tuesday afternoon, you might have noticed that right at the end of the questioning of the Murdochs, there was a 10-minute interruption, after which Louise Mensch, who was the last questioner of the Murdochs, said the following. May I start by saying, Mrs. Murdoch, as I said on Sky News, that it would show guts and leadership for you to show up today and answer questions. I must say that it shows immense guts, Mr. Rupert Murdoch, for you to continue answering questions now under the circumstances and after such a lengthy evidence session. Now, our next speaker, I think, shows some real guts for what he did. He's provoked a lot of debate, but he certainly spoke for me, and I think for many others, in expressing our hatred for the Murdoch media. Johnnie Marbles.
I'm going to be quite brief because I'm very clearly the least important person on this panel. In fact, looking at this table, I'd just like to say it's the most humble day of my life. But I'm afraid I'm going to be quite serious. I'm not going to go into comedy mode. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I did what I did and why I feel the process we've got isn't going to work. I think before we start asking how we bring the Murdochs to justice, we have to say what we want justice for. What crimes has he committed? And obviously the phone hacking scandal has uncovered a huge network of corruption within News International, but I don't think any of us are terribly surprised by that. What I think a lot of people in this room is the huge amount of deceit and racism, bigotry, the class war that's waged on some of the weakest people in our society, the electoral manipulation, the antitrust, the monopoly, the fact that he's helped people like George Bush get into power, the cheerleading for the Iraq War, the destruction of the unions at Wapping. None of these things are illegal. He didn't break any laws in doing that, and it's perhaps right to remember that when we're looking at this legal process. The only reason we have even a sniff of seeing Murdoch in court is because a few of his publications crossed the line from the nefarious into the illegal. It's interesting to note that if he'd done what he did maybe 15 years ago, it wouldn't have been illegal. It's only illegal because of the Human Rights Act, and I'd like you to remember that next time you see Murdoch publication launching another tirade against the rise of human rights in this country. Even in this case, one which highlights the rotten state of News International's corruption and callousness, there's no real chance of legal justice. The Select Committee hearings were a sham. Had they not been, we would have seen the Murdoch sat on a private jet instead of in front of a panel of MPs. It was a mock trial, nothing more, an exercise of creating the illusion of justice, yet another opportunity for the Murdoch spin machine to engage in damned limitation and try to preserve their leader's increasingly tarnished reputation. It's astonishing just how few powers the Select Committee has, actually. Whilst witnesses can be compelled to appear, the last time a corrupt media mogul did this, Robert Maxwell, he simply sat there taking the proverbial fifth, refusing to answer any questions that might incriminate him. No criminal charge was brought. Indeed, no criminal charges have been brought for misleading a Select Committee in over 100 years. Even the few legal powers that the Select Committee has are hypothetical and untested. Even if Murdoch saw his day in court, it's hard to imagine that his lawyers wouldn't find some way to slip him through on the many gaps in our sadly unwritten constitution. All of this probably sounds a little bit bleak, and it is. The sad fact is the system we have now, it was built and bought by men like Murdoch, designed not to hold them to account, but to protect their interests against people like us. Yes. But there is hope. The system we have is not the only system possible. We can and must work within the system for change and outside of it when it fails to bring the justice that we deserve. Boycotts are great, but we should be going one step further. We should be turning up to newsagents an hour before they open and taking all of the Suns and not the News of the World, the City Guard, the Times, so that nobody else can write. Sadly, Murdoch may never see the inside of a prison cell or even the inside of a witness box. But with hope, tenacity and bravery, we can build a world where the men who try to follow in his footsteps meet with the justice that they deserve. Thank you.
I wanted to start with the resignation of Paul Stevenson, just simply because it gives me the most pleasure. And there is a great mystery at the heart of this resignation. If you read the resignation speech, which I recommend you do, in the middle of it, it says, "However, the issue of my integrity is different. Let me state clearly, I and the people who know me know that my integrity is completely intact. I will not lose sleep over my personal integrity." Why then is it that he has resigned from one of the most powerful jobs in the country on £260,000 a year, this man of great integrity? Now, to answer that, you just have to go to some very, very basic facts as to what he's been up to. Fact number one is he had 5 weeks for free as the commissioner in Chapley's Health Spa, a luxury spa, as the commissioner. Brian Paddock, watching that on the telly, the police officers, said that that is in breach of very, very basic policing rules. They're taught at Hendon, you don't take even a tip off your local newsagent for fear that as a police officer you may be prosecuting that newsagent at some stage. He had £12,000 worth of free care as the commissioner on his salary. That fact alone, you'd think, is enough to resign, but there's a lot more. The managing director of the PR for Chapley's Health was a man called Neil Wallace, the same man who was in charge of Paul Stevenson's PR on £1,000 a year. The same man who previously, the same man who previously was on the News of the World executive working with Coulson. And it gets worse than that, but he went to 6 meetings, Paul Stevenson, wined and dined by the News of the World during this period. And the last thing I think is most telling of all, that in December 2009, he took time out of his diary to go to The Guardian and criticise them for their reporting of this issue of hacking. I mean, that's an extraordinary fact when you think of all his connections and the failure of the police to twice investigate this issue. So I think you can see why he went so quickly, and perhaps question that thing in the middle of his statement. The second thing I wanted to say was that I do have a bit of sadness about this event. These wonderful resignations and all these people being arrested at the very top of society. The only bit of sadness is that my dad didn't get to see it. The antithesis of this sort of journalism. So I just wanted to read something that he wrote 25 years ago, a few months after the defeat at Wapping. The capitalist argument is that when savings of this kind are made, the economy generally will benefit, since the money thus saved will find its way into other profitable investments and not rot away in the workers' pockets, cottages, holidays, etc. But what is the reality in this case? The profits will enormously increase the power and greed of one of the most powerful and greedy men on earth. They will enable Rupert Murdoch to tighten further his monopolist grip on the American media and to continue his campaign against the BBC and all standards and regulation over the media anywhere on earth. Margaret Thatcher said in a recent interview, "We have even brought sanity to Fleet Street." What she means by sanity is now clear. It is a world in which contented, well-off workers who cooperate both at work and in trade unions to increase their wealth are no longer tolerated. In their place are reactionary newspaper magnates whose single aim is to produce more and more newspapers with lower and lower standards so that their vast piles of wealth and power can grow still higher. That is the story. That was written in 1986, and that's what we see now with the hacking. I want to sort of finish on this issue about Stevenson, because there was a very important lie within his resignation speech, which he's peddled from the end of last year, and it was this. He talked about the professional and restrained approach to unexpected levels of violence in the student demonstrations. Now, every word of that sentence is a lie. The violence, the figures were sent to me the other day. The police figures say that over 60 protesters were injured in those 4 demonstrations, and it's just over 20 police officers. So this is not violent student demonstrations, these are violent police demonstrations. Alfie Meadows almost lost his life as a result of that. There's not a police officer's injury comes close to that sort of thing. And famously, Jeremy McIntyre was hauled from his wheelchair. When they talk about professionalism, it's very, very important, because it has not been mentioned amongst the media, that we must not forget that Paul Stevenson was really in charge of the 4th demonstration. And there you saw, in my view, the most embarrassing police tactic deployment in history. At the height of the student demonstration, as it mushrooms into the city, the police decide to send into that the royal entourage. We must never forget that. We must never forget that Paul Stevenson was responsible for that. Now, the last point is the police being restrained, and this is serious. There have been between 200 and 300 arrests of students, young people. If you said that about a country like Burma, that they were arresting 200 students over protesting about tuition fees, people would be appalled. This is what the police have done. Which police are now dealing with these young students? Counter-terrorism police are dealing with young students for things like aggravated trespass, for cautions in the police station. When we've got what's going on in Norway and the English Defence League allowed to demonstrate on our streets, they're spending their time over student protesters, young students, all of whom have never been in trouble before. And the last point is this, is the charging. Because now over 60 young people, students, have been charged with violent disorder. The power that the police have under the Public Order Act which I'll explain briefly, is enormous. There are 5 sections to the Public Order Act. The most serious riot, the least serious disorderly conduct. For riot you can get 10 years, for disorderly conduct you can get a fine. The police, since about 2 years ago, have started using Section 2, violent disorder, the second most serious charge that they can use. On all those sections, by the way, Section 1 to 5, the definition is pretty much the same. For any altercation that takes place on a demonstration, they could choose Section 5 or 1. There is really no difference in the definitions. But they've been starting to use Section 2. And what that means is what happened to Charlie Gilmore and what happened to Fernie, is that the courts come along and administer the custodial sentence that goes with violent disorder. Now, it seems to me, in this fight over the press and the truth and justice, which has been set up so well by Tom Watson, and The Guardian has reminded us why we read The Guardian has been so brilliant. We must raise this question all the time. We need to affiliate to the Defend the Right to Protest campaign. It's a growing campaign. It needs to be known in every household. Like Stop the War, it needs to be known, because we can. If we do that, I'm confident that we can create a climate where there's pressure on the courts and pressure on the prosecution that they can't get away with what they did in Gaza. In Gaza, 62 young Muslims, virtually all of good character, went to prison for violent disorder. It was almost ignored within the media. Now we've had that lesson. We've got the next few months to stop that happening to students, and it's incumbent on all socialists and journalists to make sure that we do everything we can to stop that happening. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I am a parent of 2 teenage daughters, both of whom, I'm proud to say, walked out of their school on the occasions of the demonstrations against the raising of tuition fees. And just to remind people what those demonstrations were about, it will cost my 2 daughters an average of £80,000 for a university education, one which I got for free, which the politicians who are introducing these fees also got for free. It means the destruction of EMA, which means that the sort of children, I'm a primary school teacher and an NUT activist, and was proud to have been on strike on the 30th of June against the robbing of my pensions. But the children I teach will also have their educations robbed from them, from the likes of people, the cabinet of billionaires who want to deprive my children of an education. And there was a news story. We don't hate journalists, believe me, because the news is so fascinating at the moment. There was a news story recently that the police were complaining that they didn't have enough toilet breaks during the student protests, which is quite unbelievable, because my 16-year-old daughter was kettled for 8.5 hours on a school day, a school night, when she was meant to go to school the next morning, in sub-zero temperatures, with no toilets, no food, no water, and so I don't have any truck with the police complaining about 45 minutes being too long. And I just want to go on to Murdoch and why I hate Murdoch and the papers that he works on. And it's not just because he's made a vast profit from hacking the phones of dead children, which I think when you put it like that, it does sound quite dramatic. But I hate him for putting that bloody page 3 in his newspapers to... Every day when you go on the tube, every day you have to see it, and every day my young girls have to see images like that of women. For their attacks on trade unions, their attacks on immigrants, their attacks on single parents, attacks on benefit claimants, the list is very long. And I think it's very interesting, isn't it, how they've railed for a long time about how prisons and prison life is so comfortable, and there are so many mod cons, and they get to watch television all day, and I really hope that some of them get to find out the real truth. It really paints a picture of how society works, doesn't it? How big business works on the cosy lunches that Michelle talked about, and Also how the police are linked in and, with this whole world of dinners and spa breaks, but also the link with our politicians. And our own Secretary of State, Michael Gove, for Education, we are we are really trying to make sure he doesn't get untainted. And before I came out this evening, there was a story that he met with Murdoch and dined with Murdoch 6 times. And there has also been a story that he got paid for his column £1,250 per hour while he was a shadow cabinet minister. And I don't know if the journalists in the room perhaps think that's a normal rate for your work, but for teachers, that it is way above our hourly rate. So we really want to expose his link with this whole thing, and really what they're interested in is smashing my union, is smashing teachers' working conditions, and in privatising education in the form of academies and free schools. And it's very interesting that one of the royal couple who just got married, and apparently that's bankrupted us as well, the first engagement they had was a charity event to raise money for a sponsor called ARC, who are an academy sponsor. And at their charity event were the royal couple, and there was also Elizabeth Murdoch. It is a very murky world where those very rich people think that going to a charity event means that they can just go ahead and privatise our schools and own our public services. And the same news bulletin just before I came out, I don't know if you're like me, and I just scream at the radio and I say, you've got to make the links, because you have one story followed by one story followed by one story, and you go, well, you've got to make the links, because there was a story about Gove and Murdoch. And then there was a story at the end about the sale of luxury wines. Don't know if you heard that people, it's absolutely booming. There's never been such a good time to sell extremely expensive wines. And you just make those links, don't you, that the rich are getting richer, but the poor are getting poorer. And then you look at the news stories about Somalia, and you just say, what society do we live in where those people who run our world and run our big businesses live that life in a bubble, while the rest of us have to work for a living, and many, many people die of starvation, and whose children are dying just because they can't get a square meal. And I think I don't want this all to blow over, this whole Murdoch story, and we just go back to business as usual, and maybe we have a cleaner newspaper, or maybe we save a bit of our pensions. I want a completely different world for my teenage daughters growing up. I want to see the likes of what happened in Egypt, where the people come to the streets. Days got rid of a dictator who they never thought they would have the courage to challenge. And I think, our time here is coming where we really need to have similar kind of unity. And I think the next chances we're going to have to show that unity is going to be the march on the Tory party conference in Manchester. But I also want all of our unions to strike together in November, or sooner if we can, but to go together and strike together, because we do not want to go back to business as usual. We've exposed the filth that is the system that we live in, and really we need to get on the streets and get rid of it for good.
Thank you, Sarah, and that brings us to our last speaker. We are at war on Libya, and the Times newspaper campaigned continuously to take us to war in Libya, using the same sorts of lies and propaganda as the Murdoch press did to take us to war in Iraq in 2003. And so I'm really pleased and proud to introduce the man who is the president of the Stop the War Coalition, and who's been an inspiration to so many of us socialists for so long, Tony BENN.
By thanking the people who organised this meeting, the people on the platform and the NUJ and all the others involved, because I think this is the beginning of a very big movement for a free press in Britain. And the very fact that people here are journalists, broadcasters, print workers, people who just want the newspapers to tell the truth about the issues that concern them, there's a huge mass of opinion forming now, and with the events that brought Murdoch into the headlines, we've got an opportunity to launch this campaign. I mean, information is the key to political life. If you know what's going on, you're much stronger. If you don't, you're much weaker. And that's why government has always wanted to keep everything secret, and why people have always wanted freedom of information. I mean, they locked up the guy who printed Hansard, locked up Luke Hansard, because he printed reports of what happened in the House of Commons. They thought if that gets out, it's going to disturb the public. And wherever you look, they want always, the governments always want to know all about us by bugging us, and don't want us to know anything about them until 30 years later, when information comes out, it's too late to do much about it. And the arrival on the scene of Murdoch, and he's only a symbol, he's not the only man, but Murdoch is, in many ways, I think, the most powerful man in the world. He's got television and newspapers in Australia, he changed his nationality to buy newspapers in America, he's got Fox News, he's got the Wall Street Journal, he's got the Times, the Sunday Times, the Sun, and he did have the News of the World, he's got Sky TV, and he's got broadcasting opportunities in China. And whoever wins a general election, Murdoch is always there. And what's happened is, and this has come out in the course of the evening, political leaders are frightened of Murdoch. And they caught him when Blair became leader of the Labour Party in 1994. The very first thing he did was to fly to Australia to persuade Murdoch he had nothing to fear by New Labour. And New Labour was, in that sense, a product of Murdoch's influence on Blair. And of course, New Labour didn't repeal Mrs. Thatcher's legislation. It went on privatising. And that's a product of the way in which Murdoch can use his power. Then we had Wapping. I went to Wapping night after night, and I had such a vivid memory of a newspaper that was produced by the Metropolitan Police and a few thousand scabs. I mean, that's what they call the free press. And now the anger about the way Murdoch behaves is growing, and with the knowledge that he buys information from the police in order to blacken the reputation of people he doesn't like is terrifying, because it means that even the police, whom we're supposed to trust, are under the influence of Murdoch, as well as controlling the newspapers and operating to undermine trade unions. So that's what we have to do. And I think tonight, with the speakers we've had, we've got a fairly clear idea of the enormous range of subjects. It means we must have free trade unions. We never repealed Thatcher's laws, and free trade unions are the key to the defence of interests of people wherever they work, wherever they are. We must also have an end of purchasing the police. We must also strengthen the democracy in the political party, particularly the Labour Party, so that people are not tempted to go along with Murdoch in hope of picking up a few extra votes. And we have to see that the British press is free, and I think myself there's a very strong case for arguing that no one person should own more than one newspaper. I think that's a very government telling the newspapers what to print, but I don't think that one person should have the power he has. So this may be the beginning, as I think it is, of a very important campaign in Britain. And when I heard a reference made to what's happening in Egypt, I think that thought occurs to me, maybe this is the English spring that we're getting now here at this meeting tonight. And one of the reasons why it's important is because the influence of Murdoch politically has been so baleful. When anyone ever tries to do anything, campaign for anything, Murdoch says you're out of touch, it'll never happen, everyone's corrupt, there's no hope, and pessimism is the enemy of progress. And I think Murdoch has been a very negative force in trying to discourage people from taking action of a kind that we know from our historical experience, if properly conducted, does produce the results we want. So that's the spirit in which I hope this meeting registers in your mind, as it does in mine, and now our work has to begin in earnest all over again. Thank you very much.
The economic crisis and the bankers, you know, there is, I think, a whole sense of, for millions of people, that this is how the thing is working, and that whole sense of how, you know, the self-serving nature of all the politicians and everything else. And I think one thing, I suppose, for all of us here as trade unionists and as socialists and activists and everything else, is it's a massive challenge for us to offer an alternative, to say it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's the thing that we've got to face, isn't it? Because if there's one thing that's happening is they're agreed in one thing, they may fight each other about their various scandals, but crapping on us. Crapping on us in terms of what's going to happen in terms of the media and what's going to happen in terms of the pensions, every other aspect. And I think one lesson of anything that I think we learned from Wapping, and I was on there over that year, every weekend going down to those pickets, was unity. Because what they tried to do in Wapping was say these people are overpaid, they're lazy, and women can come in and key in. Now women are going to get opportunities in Wapping that they didn't have in the old River, etc. And I think that's what they're going to try and do now as well, with the pensions, with every other aspect between private sector, public sector. Let's not fight for the journalist jobs, we don't need them. Let's fight for nursery workers instead. Let's say that the people with disabilities can't get benefits because actually we need to defend something else. That's what they're going to try and do, and I think the challenge for all of us is every issue like this, which actually rocks the rich and the ruling class, is use it to drive a wedge there, and actually for our side. And I think a mass demo on Wapping would be fantastic, as would be a mass demo outside the Tory party conference. This is the sort of thing, the unity of our side, I think is so vital.